Hi, welcome to Fiberchats. My name is Irina. I'm the host here. My guest today, I actually met at Vogue Knitting Live just recently, Paul Haesemeyer. Welcome to my channel.
Hi, Irina. Thank you so much for having me.
So we met and we actually got time to hang out and just chat and have a couple drinks and get to know each other a little bit. But tell me how it all started. When did you learn to knit?
Excellent question. I learned about 20 years ago now. Well, no, not 20 years ago for me, but it starts with my mom, and she learned 20 years ago, which is why I went to 20 years ago. But I learned when I was seven. My sister was born 20 years ago, and that's when my mom learned how to knit as an adult. And a few years later, I thought, oh, this is super cool. I want to learn. And she taught me how to knit, and I loved it. I was making stuff for my toys, garments, little sweaters for my stuffed animals. I remember learning how to knit one of those little craft looms and made a pair of sleeves for a denim vest that my Nana Sue sewed onto a denim vest for me. I had the coolest jacket a second grader could think of. And really, the rest is history. And I grew up with my mom, who was a knitting designer for 10 years. And so I'm kind of following in her footsteps now.
I mean, did you think it was the coolest thing ever, or was it bizarre to you? Because, like, when I'm talking about to my children, right, and they look at me and all these YouTube thingies and designing, they're like, "Oh my God!" Like, my mother now does this, right? Growing up as designer mother, how was that?
Oh, I really enjoyed it. I really liked it. And really for me, it was I was more interested in learning how to knit as a tool for like, oh, I now can make things that I'm already dreaming up, and it gives me another channel for me to create things I'm already imagining. And with my mom and just watching what she does, I thought it was so cool because she was in interweave knitting. She was in was it Simply Knitting at the time
Yeah.
before it went defunct? And, she was doing very well for herself in the magazine market. And she had her own blog, Big Sky Yarns and Crafts. And she still has collections of buttons and yarns and from those days. And it was fascinating. And I do remember how hard she worked at it because I remember once, I don't remember how old I was, but she stayed up all night and pulled an all-nighter knitting a blanket for a deadline. And I was just like, wow, this is really cool. And people know your work. And she even had her own book published eventually. And I'm like, what? You can do this with knitting? And she was friends with the yarn store. So I grew up at the yarn store. And the ladies loved getting to know me there because, like, oh, here's this little kid who's knitting for his dolls. This is really fun. And um, it was really cool just seeing how creative she could be, that she could take yarn and turn it into something special for myself, for my siblings. And she'd always let me use whatever stash I wanted. We share stashes all the time now.
So she was very supportive of you, like exploring this whole area of fiber arts.
Oh yeah. And she's just like, oh, Paul, if you're interested in it, sure, I'll teach you. And I'm like, great, let's do it. And I remember like I don't remember this, but apparently she defended me in front of a doctor. I went to a doctor when I was like second, third grade and said, oh yeah, I like to knit. And the doctor went like, oh, that's a girl's thing to do. And she was mad as hell. Just like, no, this is you do not tell my son this. And she's like, well, Paul, I'm so sorry. I wish I'd stood up for you. I'm like, I don't even remember this, Mom, but thank you. I appreciate it. But that's how it's always been for me is that she's like, well, Paul, if you're interested in it, why not? It's not harmful.
It's ironic because, like, if you look historically, it used to be male knitting guilds, and women were
Exactly.
not allowed into knitting, So now to think that, well, no, this is only for girls, or this is for grandmas, it's sort of ridiculous.
Oh no, exactly. And it's been an interesting space navigating it as a man in a traditionally women's space now and holding respect for it. And it's really interesting. I mean, even here in New York, like growing up, I grew up in Billings, Montana, pretty small community of 110,000 people. So it is a city, but small compared to where I'm at now in New York. And I really didn't know any men who knit there.
Right.
Fun fact though, Franklin Habit taught his first knitting class ever in Billings. So it's really fun to reconnect with him and have this little full circle moment. And then now that I live in New York, I last night I was here at Cleo's for a men's night, and I'm like, wow, we actually have enough men in New York who knit and craft who we can actually get together and hang out. Like this is really cool and really special that we now have spaces and places where men can be the majority if they want to, and that we can meet up over mutual interests.
Well, before we go deeper into that, and I want to come back to that conversation, tell me a little bit like your childhood journey. So, like, you learned how to knit. How did it go? Like, were you immediate designer, like from day one, or did you follow somebody's patterns?
Oh, I was always following other people's patterns. I mean, I do like some swatching and do some of my own experimentation. Um, just because like I was a big crafter in terms of, oh, I can make a rectangle and turn this into a mermaid tail or just those kind of practical hands-on type techniques. And so really like as a child, learned how to knit, learned how to sew, cross stitch, just those kind of mediums. And then in junior high and high school, started doing more like cosplay and costume making and like, okay, let's figure out how to like do all the shapes and pattern making and which led me to kind of a career in costume design, not really costume design formally, but I'm like, wait a second, I can actually be a professional in this field. So I ended up going to school for theater and focusing on costume design in particular, a little liberal arts education. And when knitting kind of took a backseat in high school, I'd say. And then when I got to college, I'm like, well, what am I going to do with my free time? I'm already working in a costume shop. Like, oh, let's just get back into knitting and start making sweaters again. And it was a good way for me to connect with my family back home. I moved from Montana into Indiana, helped me feel connected with my family, less homesick. And I'd always just follow other people's patterns and just go through them. One of my first sweaters, or I think it was my second sweater I ever made for myself, was a free vintage Aran sweater, cables. I mean, I was cabling as a fifth grader, and my mom had this beautiful Irish wool. She's like, "Yeah, Paul, you can use it." I'm like, "Great, thank you." And it was fun. It was just like, "Oh yeah, this is really fun seeing how knitting and costume and clothing construction are starting to blend together." And that's why I've always been attracted to sweaters as kind of a maker of like, okay, how can I take these flat pieces and turn them into a garment? So that's really kind of my story with knitting and approaching it as almost less as a knitter and approaching it as, okay, how do I make this piece? How do I make this garment? How do I execute these textures, these silhouettes as a clothing maker?
So when you think about like new pattern idea, right? Like you coming up with the idea, the design, do you start with like pattern for sewing and then translate it into knitting pattern? How does the process work?
It depends. I usually like for a design call or if I'm design like getting yarn support for something, I usually start off with a mood board where I collect ideas of like, okay, what themes do I want to explore? What textures do I want to explore? I create mood boards on Pinterest, kind of put my ideas together. Then I go in, put them on a kind of a really just a PowerPoint slide. I'm like, okay, what am I drawn through here? I use a lot of writing of like, okay, what are the images? What are the ideas I want to explore? What are the stories? Writing is a big part of my design process where it's like, that's how I really kind of figure out what exactly am I trying, what are the ideas I'm trying to grasp with the idea here, or even just what are the technicalities? What are the things I want to explore next as an artist? Um, and I do reference sewing patterns every once in a while, especially when silhouette's concerned. I mean, when I'm looking at doing a set and sleeve, I was trying to use some formulas, trying to use some pattern books. And I'm like, wait, Paul, you've drafted sleeves before when you're making shirts. Why not just draw it out and flat pattern it out and then adjust your knitting pattern to do that? And then I did, and I'm like, wait, it worked. Why am I surprised? I don't know. So it's been nice because for me, it allows me to take a look at garment making as a whole, where it's like, wait a second, what are the shapes that I need? Where since I've made so many garments to begin with, I know what shapes should be, what things are behaving, and things like what doesn't look right. Why is this shape not happening? Why does this look too long? Why does this look too long? Why does this look too wide? Is this too shallow of an arm size? Is too narrow? So it's nice because of my garment construction history, it's easier now for me to translate a 2D object into how it's going to fit on the body. Like, and that's what ultimately is what we're called to do is how do I make a successful garment that'll fit me, fit other people, and also show off the textures, techniques, etc. that I want.
Well, talking about fitting the body, what kind of bodies are we talking about? Because a lot of your patterns are for men, but then there are other patterns that sort of unisex, and some of the patterns are for women. How do you decide who you're going to be knitting for or creating pattern for?
I always design with myself in mind of things of what do I want to wear? Even for Vogue knitting, it was modeled on a woman. That pattern was originally designed for a man. And just like, okay, what's something that I would want to make for myself and that I could see myself wearing? And it's interesting because I'd argue most of my patterns can be unisex, but then people automatically assume, oh, it's only for men or only for women just because of how it's modeled. I'm like, no, that's not the case. It's just we automatically add a bias simply because of how it's modeled, how it's displayed. Um, yeah, so usually my patterns are designed for my body and my body type, which is usually pretty long. I have very long arms, and thankfully, I'm a classic actor size in terms of I'm like a men's large typically for clothing. So now it's just like, okay, how do I translate that for a larger size, smaller size? I try to keep my shapes as simple as possible with like rectangles and boxes and like, okay, how can I make this approachable for knitters in terms of I see this is a front, this is a back, these are sleeves. Let's not overcomplicate it because then I know that knitters can make adjustments as needed because that's what we do for knitting, right?
Right.
Is we make adjustments. And I remember making adjustments for my own sweaters when I use someone else's pattern. I'm like, oh, I need to lengthen the sleeve here or deepen the neckline, or, it's those tips and tricks where I automatically know, okay, I'm going to modify this. What are some modifications that people can make and feel comfortable making? And how can I teach other people to make those modifications if needed?
I was reading a book about Bach and when like his time when he was writing music, and it used to be a skill that like almost every musician possessed to just improvise, to sit down and somebody would play you a little theme and you could do improvisation. And now it's completely lost skill, and like almost no musicians know how to do that. Do you feel we as knitters lost somewhere along the way that freedom of modification and that ability to modify the main idea? And how do you deal with that in your patterns?
I think beginner knitters are more likely to do that because beginner knitters see a pattern, they think, oh, I have to execute this perfectly, exactly. No. And it's only with the more experienced knitters who've had some time, who've built some confidence, that they're able to make modifications as needed. Now, what I have learned is European knitters completely out knit American knitters by a landslide. And the reason why I say that is when I lived in Latvia for the year, every single person was making sweaters for themselves that fit perfectly without needing patterns. They just see something and make it. And that's what I think is kind of interesting is that we've kind of lost that idea of custom made clothing for ourselves. And there's an excellent YouTuber or historical YouTubers, Nicole Rudolph and Abby Cox, and they discuss history of fashion. And I know Nicole had an interesting video about how once clothing was starting to be manufactured, we lost the idea of what well-made garments look like and what well-fitting garments look like because we expect the manufacturer to be perfect. But in reality, for the majority of human existence, all clothing was custom made.
Right.
So every single person was well aware of what their body is, what their needs were, and how to achieve a proper silhouette rather than changing their body themselves. And that's what I really think we lost is less of a, not necessarily skills, but an awareness of, oh, we don't know what good fitting clothing looks like because we just have lost that over time with commercialization of clothing, manufacturing, etc. Because I'd argue like even some people back in the day who are getting custom clothing, they're wealthy. Did they know how to sew? Maybe. But they wouldn't have had the trade skills that the tailors and seamstresses would have had to make that garment. But they were aware of what works for their body and what doesn't. And I think that's where we're at right now, where it's like we sort of understand what works for us and what doesn't, but we just don't know how to express it or execute it. And now we're expected to do it for ourselves because we don't take it to a tailor to have a custom fit and tailored to our bodies.
We talk about difficulties like of breaking into this industry. Do you think that being a man is making it more difficult or easier for you? And also, do people take you seriously because you are very young in this industry?
Good question. I do know I'll get more attention because I'm a man in the industry. I mean, I was at H&H Cologne, Germany last spring, and I was chatting with Vim and what is Vim and Den? Yeah, Vim and Den. And they're a fun little dynamic male duo of sock patterns and sock making. And they're like, Paul, do you think we really would have gotten these books if we weren't men? I'm like, oh, good point. And I feel the same way because I don't know. You haven't asked about it, but with my Fulbright grant in Latvia, I don't know if I would have been taken as seriously if I was a woman. And I'm wondering how much of this of me getting this grant is, oh, here's a young American man who's interested in this. And I think a lot of people took me a bit more seriously there because I was a young man interested in it. Well, I know for sure? No, but I do know I'm more visible. And it's an interesting reckoning where it's how do I um how do I honor what is women's craft as a man, as well as, I mean, it's semi-related. I had a with my project, I wrote an article for Modern Daily Knitting about Latvia. I accidentally labeled a cathedral St. Patrick's instead of St. Peter's, innocent mistake. And there were some Latvian Americans who are like, "Oh, look at this! Here's a young American acting like he's an expert in knitting." I'm like, "That's not my project. That's not my experience. This is not what I'm coming from. I'm not coming to this project as an expert. I'm coming to this project as an observer, as a documenter, as a storyteller." And what I find interesting is that I've had some students in my hometown, um, and they were innocent by this, but they're just making small talk, like, "Oh yeah, my knitting teacher, he's a man." And her friend goes, "Oh, is he a great knitter?" And she's like, "Yeah." And she's like, "Yeah." And her friend's like, "Yeah, I heard all the male knitters are all excellent knitters." I'm like, are people assuming I'm an expert because I'm a man? Now, I am a very good knitter. I don't consider myself an expert, but I am talented at what I do. You know, I spent a lot of time doing this, but it was an interesting assumption to see this automatic association with me being a male knitter being, oh, I'm automatically excellent at what I do.
Right.
Am I surprised by how much I've been able to do at the ripe old age of 26? Yes. It's still difficult, we're at a point with this industry where publications are dying. Thankfully, I was lucky to get into Vogue knitting somehow before the magazine stopped publishing. Nora Gon was the editor, and I'm like, oh, Nora Gon wanted me. This is amazing. And I had to tell my mother right away. And she was so excited for me. And she tried for many years to get into the magazine, but I somehow got in. And that was the interesting thing, Irina, is I really came to knitting design as, oh, as a side hustle, here's something I can do when I was working in Alabama as a costume maker at the Shakespeare Festival there. And I got accepted in a few magazines and started taking off. And just like, wait a second, I think I can do more of this. And it wasn't until my first Vogue Knitting Live where I'm like, oh, people know me here. People recognize me. Maybe I can do this. Let's see what happens. And I had an advisor who she said, Paul, have you thought about a knitting Fulbright? I'm like, no, what does that mean? It haunted me all summer. And I mean, knitting, I can now say that knitting has taken me across the world. And I've been able to live for 10 months in an amazing country with an amazing knitting heritage, getting to know them, getting to know their stories, be a soft ambassador, pun intended. Yeah, so it's one of those, I feel like I'm constantly working to get my work known of it's not easy making content, putting on Instagram. I'm grateful for opportunities with Vogue Knitting Live and getting to know people in person. Like those are my favorite events to do. I love going to Rhinebeck. I love going to Vogue because it's like, oh yeah, I finally get to talk to people about what I've been working on, what other people have been working on, seeing how we can collaborate, make magic happen. I mean, that's what I think is the most special about it. Because the internet is hard to crack sometimes because of algorithms, but when I meet someone in person, we can make that connection happen in real life and see what happens.
Are you surprised, like when you come to a festival like Vogue, that you meet people and you immediately feel like you've been friends for like decades and you just met because you have love of the craft in common?
I was surprised by it the first time. It was magical, and I loved it. It was really inspiring. Where it's just one of those like, oh, I never felt so easy, and I felt like I was enough, and I felt like, oh, people really respect me for what I do here and what I care about. And they could tell that I'm passionate about this, and to be recognized for it was really inspiring and really just, it was life changing in a way of like, oh, I feel seen. I feel like I found my people. With my first Vogue, that previous fall, I was diagnosed with depression and I was put on some medication. And so my joke was for 2023, well, my New Year's resolution was forced upon me, and nothing like meds, therapy, and Vogue knitting live to truly change your life.
Is that stressful to be you, like to be a knitwear designer in this world? Is it lonely also at times?
It can be. It can be lonely. Stressful, yes, because I'm still trying to figure out how am I going to get it done? How do I manage my time? I'm used to reporting to managers and reporting to people who organize things. I'm like, oh, how do I organize this for myself? How do I get what I want done? It is lonely in terms of I am my own person, and thankfully that's why I'm glad I'm here in New York. And I'm here at Cleo's a lot, this yarn store, because it's a place where I can come in, work, meet like-minded people here. Um, it's nice because I've been able to make some good knitting friends and design friends where it's like, okay, what are you working on? What are our goals for the week? And I would say when I was over in Latvia for those 10 months, it was more difficult than I thought it would be. It's really the whole project felt more like an independent research project than working in a lab in biology or something like that, where I realized if I don't go out and see people, I will not be leaving my apartment.
Right.
I need to get out and do stuff. And in a similar place I am in New York, I'm like, okay, if I don't get out and do this, how am I meeting people? So it does get to a point where it seems like in this industry, or maybe it's just being an entrepreneur in general, it's like, okay, I just have to constantly put myself out there every single day to make connections, to get shit done, to I don't know if I'm allowed to curse on this channel, but it's just one of those, if I don't put myself out there every day, then what am I accomplishing?
Right.
And Sunday, and I didn't realize how much I took it for granted connections with people until I was working independently for a year. I'm like, oh, how do I do this? How do I approach people? How do I make that introduction, that cold introduction? And yeah,
Have
it's a
people
lot.
been helpful? Like, have other designers been helpful and share or generous in sharing their knowledge and helping you along the way?
Oh, absolutely. That's what I also loved about Vogue is at Vogue, I was able to get connected with Patty Lyons. She's been really helpful in just helping me navigate publishing and who to work with and get connected with some of her people. Um, Knitters are such an open book, honestly. And I find it interesting because in any niche, there's always this little like a celebrity culture. And honestly, there really isn't. We're all still people. And I found I've been able to approach almost everyone I've wanted to reach out to and just like, hey, I'm working on this. Can I ask you some advice about how you organize and how you do things? A few weeks ago before Vogue, I'm like, hey, Nora Gone, can we have a Zoom call and chat about your process? She's like, sure. I'm like, who am I? What am I doing? Like, in some ways, and even when I was at the gala, the cocktail party at Vogue, I still feel a little bit like, oh, I'm a little kid at the big kids table now. And I know I'm a big kid and I'm with the big kids now, but it still feels a little bit like, oh my gosh, I'm still like this. It's been cool and special and I'm grateful for it.
Well, when I'm thinking about artists and the world of design, there is this balance of like, yes, it's your career and you have to make a living doing that, but it also has to be this free flowing mind and like inspirations that cannot be timed and cannot be planned. How do you balance that? How do you approach the next pattern?
I'm still balancing it. And I don't think any artist has ever truly figured it out. But what I try to focus on is that's helped me a lot as an artist and as a maker is done is beautiful. It doesn't have to be perfect, but just getting it done and putting it out and sharing it with the world is enough. Because we're all still making mistakes, we're all still learning, we're all still growing. Um, I think a lot of knitters expect pattern designers to have everything perfect at the first time when you publish. I'm like, no, that's not going to be the case. We're all still learning and growing and changing. We're still people. Um, in terms of free flowing and being explorer versus getting stuff done, I mean, I still got to pay the bills. I still got to find a day job and make money somehow. And that's where I'm at, where it's like, I'm still not at a point quite yet in my knitting career, and I'd like to eventually make a living off of it, but I'm not there quite yet. But I'm just thinking about what are the steps I can take. And for me personally, right now, it is thinking about who are the companies I could work with collaboration wise, because yarn companies, they love giving out yarn support. I'm like, who do I want to work with? Who can I get exposure with? Those have been really the questions that have been asked right now is like, okay, I have the designs, I think, a pretty good audience. Now the question is, how can I find more customers and how can I find more people to introduce my work to? And that's through collaborations with Lavi and May, Brooklyn Tweed. Barocco has been one of my biggest supporters since I first started designing, and a few other companies. So now, especially after Vogue, I got boxes of like yarn from company. Like, okay, Paul, go for it. We trust you, and it's honestly really inspiring, really empowering to see these companies be like, yeah, Paul, just go for it, see what happens. And now I'm like, okay, how am I gonna get all this knitting done and get the patterns out? I'm like, we'll figure that out one step at a time, create systems. And that's really the thing for me is what I've realized is trying to stay disciplined in terms of setting up systems that help me stay organized, help me figure out what I want. Those have been the more challenging things of, okay, how do I stay disciplined? How do I remember these tools are in place to help me succeed in the long term, not just right now? Because ultimately we all just want to just knit and just knit all day. I want to knit all day, but I can't.
Right. Well, when it comes to like pattern designs, you know, and I know that if you create some cute little beanie, you can sell 10,000 copies. If you're going to create something elaborate and intricate, people are going to be like, oh, no, I don't think I can do that. And you don't sell anything. How do you decide on what you're going to design? And also, how do you convince people to be more adventurous in their knitting?
That is an excellent question. What I found for myself personally, because I don't want to burn out, is I am ultimately inspired by sweaters and textures. So what I've learned is to pay attention to the designs and the ideas that haunt me for like months. And I'm like, okay, what are like there's this one design that I'll be making out of some Brooklyn tweed, and I've been thinking about it since 2022, I think. Maybe it was 2023. But it's been around it for a while. I'm like, okay, it's finally happening. So I know that's an idea worth pursuing. Um, Personally, beanies and accessories are a little more difficult for me to explore just because they're not as intricate, but I do know they sell well. And what I'm kind of taking a look at now is designers like Andrew Maurer and Stephen West are good at this, where they make a design and then they apply all the textures and all the design elements to a variety of different items. And now I'm looking into, okay, how can I do that with my designs? And how can I take my Stellar Sailor cable and turn that into a little scarf, turn that into a cowl, turn that into a hat? And that's really kind of where I'm looking at of it's not rocket science. I don't have to reinvent the wheel every time. It's figuring out what do I already have and what can I do with it to move it to the next step or the next level? Because honestly, I'm thinking about it, I'm like, well, why haven't I already done that? I'm like, because it's tedious, it takes time, you want to work on more creative stuff, Paul. But I'm like, yeah, but that's the stuff that I think people are introduced to. And I do know most of my designs are for more adventurous knitters. I kind of like to describe myself as the person in between Jared Flood and Stephen West, just in the middle there. And I think some of my patterns are definitely simpler. Like my Hearsay cardigan is just it's two color brioche. And it's really fairly simple construction, but it's a good way for people to get introduced to my aesthetic or my style of like, oh, but here are the colors he used for this. Or if you want to try to my Stellar Sailor sweater, but then you're like, oh, I don't want to try them. You can also try it on the cowl. So that's why I think I want to like try to take some of my design ideas and made motifs and whatever I've designed and put it into simpler garments so that people can experiment and try it out on a smaller piece that's less commitment than a full-blown sweater, which I
Well,
need to do. We haven't done it yet. We're getting there.
let's talk about your aesthetics a little bit because also like coming back to the fact that you're 26, right? Do you feel like your design aesthetics is already being formed firmly, or do you feel like you're changing every year? Because, and also like to continue in that aesthetic conversation, when we think about men designs, there's basically like a lot of Aaron sweaters, sort of fisherman sweaters, but you are more bohemian sort of in your designs. So talk a little bit about your aesthetics.
Yes, my aesthetic is still changing. I mean, I think our aesthetics change for most of our life. Um, I do know I like to, my goal with my designs are finding approachable designs like techniques that people can still find, or what's the term? I want to make interesting designs that people still find approachable. That's the term I need. Because I love Stephen West's designs and they're beautiful artistic explorations and they're very fun and it's a good like artistic fun way to explore yarns and textures. But I think a lot of people are afraid to try his patterns because they're like, well, I don't know if I see myself wearing it. So I want to make sure that all that my designs are still seen or viewed as wearable, which is why I often feel like, okay, would I wear this? So yeah, my aesthetic is very kind of bohemian, a bit of texture, and I do like looking at modern trends and seeing like, okay, what's happening right now in the modern fashion market? How can I turn it into a knitting pattern? What's something I'm excited about? What's something that's different that I haven't seen before? And sometimes it's not even so much like new stitches, it's just how people are arranging it. I've been loving bobbles lately because it's a fun way to add texture that isn't uber feminine or uber masculine. It's just this fun little detail. Um, I know it's going to change in the future. I've already noticed I've been gravitating this year with some of my designs of less oversized fits and more, a bit more fitted stuff, some polos, some more like classic pieces in a way. Um, so, you know, it changes and it varies, but I still think I still like my approach is still the same of, okay, what are some pieces I can make that are kind of either vintage, like I do like a lot of vintage inspiration where it's men used to wear these, but then we stopped. And now it's seen as this kind of whimsical flair in a way. And that's why I really am not known for cables or for color work or for anything. It's more like I feel like I'm capturing this energy of I don't want to even say whimsy, but just playfulness. Just kind of like, hey, we can have fun, but it's still wearable, it's still chic. It's still like I'm still gonna wear this. Like I made this jacket working on the pattern now, but I wear it every day now. And I'm like, I've been needing a cardigan for who knows how long. And I'm like, well, I finally made one. Now I need 12. But it's been interesting. And it's a question that I'm always looking at of what excites me next. And that's really what I keep asking myself of what am I excited by and hopefully other people are excited by it too.
Well, as a theater costume designer, if you could imagine yourself waking up in another century or another like timeline, where would you want to find yourself?
In high school, it would have been the 18th century. I was obsessed with the 18th century fashion for a while. Now, I would say probably the 50s, 60s in terms of tailoring and knitwear and silhouette. Like I like cowboy cut jeans. I like nice rod made denim. I feel like I'm turning into more of my brother where he's always like Paul tailoring Japanese denim, whatever. But now I'm like, oh, I appreciate the handy, like the craft of silhouette. I also like a bit of the 70s flair with it. So I kind of like this idea of broken in, worn, timeless, not timeless. I just thrifted a pair of jeans that are so broken in, but they're so comfy. So it's like I've been loving that kind of vibe lately where it's still, I can still wear it even though it's probably at least 10 years old. And that's what I want to do with my sweaters is that anyone can wear them whenever they want. But I want to make sure it isn't like uber minimalist because I feel like people think timelessness with minimalism, and I'm like, no, this is not what this means. And a fun fact in the costuming community, there's a phrase called vintage style, not vintage values,
Right.
because people are like, "Oh, don't you wish you lived there?" And people are like, "No, because of racism, sexism, homophobia, all this other stuff." So
Running water.
that's exactly running water, modern medicine, exactly.
Right.
So
Tell
yeah,
me a story of you rubbing shoulders with Uma Thurman.
yes. My in 2019. And I realized last year, I'm like, wait, it's been 5 years since I did that. And in 2019, I was a sophomore and I got connected with Williamstown Theater Festival, a summer stock theater festival in the Berkshire Mountains in Williamstown, Massachusetts, at Williams College. Sense of theme. Anyway, and they gave all the interns all the scripts for the season. So I was reading through all the scripts, seeing what plays we were working on, and they were doing a new production of Henrik Ibsen's Ghosts. And Uma Thurman is the lead in the role. And I realized her character is knitting on stage. So on like the first or second day, I saw the shop manager. I'm like, "Hi, Nicole. I'm a knitter. I noticed this character knits. If you need any knitting, let me know." And it was, I think, mid-July, halfway through. She pulls me aside. She's like, "Paul, you're knitting the shawl." I'm like, "What?" And like, "You're knitting a shawl. Get together at like a design packet, make a proposal. You're doing a shawl for Ms. Thurman." I'm like, "What?" So I immediately called my mother then. I'm like, "Mom, I'm making a shawl for Uma Thurman." She's like, "What?" Yeah. So we're just like trying to figure out, okay, how are we gonna make this? What are we gonna do? We're like, okay, we need to do like we cannot go lighter than DK because I got to get this done in a week. Like it took me 40 hours upstairs just knitting like a madman, listening to my audiobooks. And it was fun because went to Ravelry, found a free lace pattern, made a nice little lace motif. The assistant designer and I, we drove to Webb's Yarn Warehouse in Massachusetts, and I'd never been before, so it was really fun visiting there. Grabbed some swatch, grabbed some skeins to bring back. We let Uma choose which one she wanted, and she wanted the Madeline Tosh DK. I'm like, you have good taste, Uma, and she is a knitter too.
He's a knitter, yeah.
Yeah, and so we went back, got the Madeline Tosh, wound it all up. We didn't have a ball or a Swiss, so I had to ask all my friends, all the interns of the summer, was like, "Hi, help me wind this. Hold this. I'll just wind this as fast as we can by hand." And my parents came and visited. They got to see the first performance, and what I didn't realize until after I got it done, I had to rig the shawl so that she was knitting on it. So I knit the whole shawl, had a few rows of garter and rigged it so that it wouldn't fall apart because she rips it off the needles and drapes it over her dying son at the end of the play. And I was resetting it every day. And I was getting a I was getting a note from the wardrobe supervisor, like, "Hey, she's making this note." I'm like, "I don't know what she means. I'm just gonna keep resetting it." And she's like, "Oh, I could," Miss Thurman, Uma was like, "Oh, I'll reset it every day." I'm like, "No, I'll just take care of it for you. I just want to make sure it's doing okay. I don't want it falling apart." And so I was taking care of it. Then at one point, the stage management intern comes in and is like, "Paul, Uma would like to speak with you." And I'm like, "What?" So I put down the ironing, go to her dressing room, like, "Hello, yes." So she explains, like, "Hey, thank you so much for working on this. I just, when it's set up, I'd like to have it mid-row so I can just pick it up and knit." I'm like, "Oh yeah, that makes sense." And that's what was being lost in translation somehow. But during all this, the wardrobe supervisor walks in, or looks at me like, "What's going on?" The director comes in and is like, "Oh, who's he?" And I'm like, I go, "I'm the knitter." Uma goes, he's the knitter. And the director goes, "Oh, it's a beautiful piece. Thank you so much." I'm like, "Anytime." And then I walk out of the dressing room after this, and everyone looks at me like, "What were you just doing in there?" I'm like, I'll tell you later. I'll explain later. And if a few weeks went by. I was in the green room resetting the shawl, and she comes in to grab her food, and she's like, "Oh, thank you so much for taking care of it." I'm like, "Oh yeah, of course. Just want to make sure it's taken care of." And yeah, da, da, da. And she goes, as she's leaving, she says, I love an object with emotional weight to it. And she leaves. And I was just like, "Thank you, thank you." And we ordered double the Madeline Tosh just in case something went wrong. And I have all that yarn still in my stash, and I haven't done anything with it yet because I don't know what to do with it. Someone's
Yeah.
like, "Make the shawl again, Paul." I'm like, "No, it's not happening." Um, but it was so fun and so special. And there's a review in the New York Times of the play, and there's a photo of her front and center with her dying son, the character, the character's dying son, and the shawl is draped over his shoulders. So I can say my work was in the New York Times. I was
You made New York
uncredited,
Times, yeah.
but I'm like, oh my God. And
That's my show.
even and that was before I started doing knitting design. And one of my managers was like, "Well, Paul, have you thought about doing knitting design?" I'm like, "No, not really. And just having fun, just I'm doing theater. This is what I wanted to do and what I wanted to go to school for at the time." And since then, it's just kind of taken off more and more and more. And it's been really special and really fun.
There is another concept that like some knitters swear by and a lot of knitters hate, sort of. Swatch. What's your relationship with swatching?
Oh, I swatch. I always swatch. It gives me a good start for a sweater design. Plus, it lets me play with the yarn a bit. And I like, playing with it and experimenting. I recently got some cotton yarn from Circulo, and in their catalog, they said you can use this DK yarn with a US 9. And I had to prove them right or wrong. I'm like, how does this work? So I had to try it. It works somehow. But usually after I swatch, I do a sleeve first anyway, just in case something else goes wrong or the gauge changes or something else happens, but I do swatch.
What kind of information are you searching from the swatch?
I am looking for how the yarn behaves. Less so much what my gauge is. I mean, yes, but I just want to make sure I like the fabric it's making, make sure it's behaving. Is this the right amount of drape? Just I like swatching less for the math information and more for what's the hand it's having, what textures can it create? Do I think it's going to be good for this for color work? Is it not? Yeah, I'm just learning. I'm getting to know the fabric. It's a speed dating with knitting. That's what I consider
I like that.
swatching.
I like that concept. When you come to a festival like Vogue Knitting, do you buy yarn? Like I know that people send you boxes of yarn, but like is there something that calls your soul and you're like, I have to buy it?
I've been much better about it. I did not buy any. No, I did bought one skein this year, Vogue this year. Um, when I do buy yarn, it has to be something very special where I'm just in love with it. Um, that was Camellia Fibers worsted. It was a beautiful, soft, non-superwash merino wool that felt like superwash. It was so soft. And then some of Wandering Flocks colors. I've bought a few skins for them. This time at Vogue, I also like supporting small artists when I can, especially queer artists. And there's a guy I knew from Instagram, and he has his own little independent label of yarn. I'm like, Upland Fiber Company. I'm like, yes, I need to buy your yarn. I want to try it because I've been seeing this forever now. So I bought a skein of that. And so really, I try to be intentional about my yarn purchases now because I'm like, okay, who do I want to invest in? What it, that's really what it comes down to is who are the people I want to work with and who do I want to see succeed?
Right. When you were in Latvia, was that inspiring, humbling? What would be the first word that comes to mind?
Uh, all of the above. It really inspiring is the best word. It was very humbling. It's I didn't really understand the concept of culture shock until I got there, and I'm like, oh, this is a like actual condition. This isn't just me being surprised. It's just my brain being constantly fatigued trying to figure things out because everything I've taken for granted isn't. I nearly had a panic attack in the grocery store my first day there, just because I'm like, nothing is in English. Okay, let's just look for things that I recognize and go from there. Um, I think the most inspiring thing about Latvia was just being able to be a knitting artist for a year. Um, whatever that looked like and being open for interpretation because every week changed from week to week. And it was humbling because I thought I knew winter in Montana and the Latvian darkness was very humbling. It's about the same latitude as Juneau, Alaska,
Right.
if not further north. Um, that and it just, I'm there doing what I love. And I forgot how hard it can be to do that. A friend of mine's like, well, Paul, following your dreams isn't always rainbows and unicorns. I'm like, thank you. I needed that reminder. And I learned a lot and it was really kind of empowering. I think that's the best way to describe it is my time there was empowering in terms of, oh, if I could survive a year being a knitting artist, working with people, getting to know people, then I could feel like I could do anything in a way.
Oh, what are those dreams? What are your dreams for the next 26 years?
Good question. Well, getting my book done for listeners, I got a Fulbright grant to write a knitting book in Latvia. Now I'm looking for a publisher, and so I'm getting the book done this year. That's what I'm planning on, at least getting the writing done. And then for the next 26 years, I'd love to continue writing some books. I'd love to do a book with my mom and my grandma at some point because both of them are knitters. I do want to bring both of them to Vogue Knitting next year. My grandma will be 80 this fall. I'm like, oh, it'd be a fun little 80th birthday party for her. Bring her to Times Square
Sure,
for
yeah.
a knitting conference.
Mhm.
She's been dying to meet Patty Lyons, and she's jealous that I get to hang out with her. I'm like, Nana Sue, I'll bring you over. And I tell her some things about Franklin. She's like, well, how do you know that about Franklin? I'm like, because I talked to him, Nana Sue. Like, I'm friends with him. So that's been really, like, that's really where I'm at, where for the next 26 years, I'm still discovering, I'm still figuring it out what I want. And for the first time in my life, I'm like, well, what do I want? And I think moving forward, it's continuing to develop Paul Haesemeyer designs, a knitting brand, continuing to write books, do some writing, have some fun, make some beautiful art, and try to have fun while I'm doing it. Because if I'm not having fun, then what's the point?
Well, I'm so glad we got to meet, and I'm gonna be watching your journey and follow it. And I wish you all the success and hope to see your book published this year or next year or sometime very soon.
Yes,
Thank
things
you.
are in the works. We'll see what happens.
Thanks so much, Paul. Thank you for being my guest
Thank
today.
you, Irina.
Thank you.